I work for Electric Cloud, but before that, I was actually a build and release engineer for almost 10 years, doing a lot of database deployments too. So I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about, first of all, what's the evolution of database deployments? Where have we gone from? The first thing kind of is like manual production. So this is kind of like where we would go onto the production database and we'd make the changes. After that, we kind of started doing some different manual DB, so we'd start to write some SQL scripts, start to do that, and then let's just go run them on production manually. After that, I kind of call this the auto one. This is where we started automating some of the generation of the scripts. We started doing a little bit, we have the hammer now, but we're still not really doing too much. And then the next one is, kind of my AutoDB++. What do I mean by this? I mean kind of, this is where we get to where, we're automating the stuff, but, we're still not really doing too much on it. We've just automated all the way through. We've automated the scripts, and we've automated putting it on there. So where can we go from there kind of is what I want to focus on in this talk. There's a lot of things we can do kind of for the future of database deployments. So I want to talk about kind of what I'm going to call DB Anywhere. So basically, I just want to kind of as the part of this presentation, show you guys what can you do to completely automate your database process and to help with rollbacks and stuff like that, to help with all of those things. So before I get started with that, I want to tell you a little bit, why is the database important? So to me, the database is a lot of like the brains of the application. It contains a lot of your logic and critical business data. It's not just like it's your application. It also has your customer records. It has all of your customer data is in the database. So like I said, it's the brains of the application. And making changes to a database, I kind of see it like brain surgery sometimes. It's really complex. Every time I talk to somebody, it's like, okay, well, databases are great, but I've done my automation for everything, and then there's the database. Let's just keep them off to the side because we don't really know what to do with them. So why is it complicated? Why do we have complex stuff here? First of all, there's more than one application on a database often. We don't always just have one application per database. We oftentimes have more than one database on a database server. And it's our most critical data, like I just said. I cannot emphasize this enough. The database is what contains everything that people care about. It's what we care about. And why is it complicated? Schema changes is what always comes up. What about when I change the schema? What happens? What do we do? How do we do it? So I'm going to tell you, what are some things that we can consider before we get into some of my ideas and stuff that we can use for deploying databases. First of all, testing. We have to figure out how to test databases better. Right now, how do we do the testing? What testing should be done? Should it be done before, during, or after? And what do you do if your testing breaks? Do you have an automated rollback? Do you have a manual intervention? Who decides these things? We don't necessarily know. And testing often can't happen because you can't copy an entire database. So what about rollback? I like this kind of image, now panic and rollback. Everyone panics when something goes wrong. If a database deployment goes wrong, everybody usually starts screaming at all the DBAs, the developers, what happened, what happened? So you can think about, at what point did you fail? Did you corrupt tables? Do you have partially updated data? Was the database partially deployed and then something failed? So do you have like some, weird data in your database now? Was the system running? Lots of us cannot necessarily, take down our entire system for the database because, we have to be online all the time. You don't want to say, hey, you can't really buy anything between 8 and 5 because I'm doing this. So how do we automate it? What do we do with automation? First of all, who owns the automation? One of the things is, like, what do you do if you fail? What tools should you use? What supported features are in the tools? I work for a company that sells an amazing tool that supports automated rollback. Do you support rolling deployments? So another thing to think about is distributed development and infrastructure. How do your developers merge code? You've got database developers, you've got several people working on the same table. How do they merge that code? How do they do that? How do your developers integrate the work that you're working on? How do you handle some of the distributed systems across the world? So now I'm going to kind of go a little bit more into what are some of the methods that you can use for database deployment? This is kind of some of the things. First of all, like I said, SQL scripts. There's lots of SQL scripts that are there that are really great. This is something that lots of people have had lots of success with SQL scripts. So there are definitely advantages and disadvantages to this. One of the advantages, you can have fast deployments. You're just running a SQL script. You may have minimal downtime. You may have all of this. What I want to put in here is when it works. The biggest issue I've seen with just writing SQL scripts is they break. They don't work all the time. We don't know what we're doing. So this kind of gets into some of the disadvantages of SQL scripts. It requires a developer to never make mistakes. I'm sure since I was a developer, I never made a mistake, but maybe I did. It also requires lots of testing. How do you truly test your rollback? How do you truly deploy and test your rollback in a script? And it can be error prone. Like I said before, how do multiple developers merge their work into a SQL script? Do you guys simply copy and paste stuff together? Who knows? But there still are some people that should use SQL scripts. Who should use the SQL scripts? One of the things is small databases sometimes can get by with using just SQL scripts and be just fine. Oftentimes, small development teams can get away with this too. If you just have simple changes, a SQL script might work well. And finally, I do have to say, I do realize a lot of us work with legacy databases, and that's your only option sometimes. So what are some other methods? Another method that I have that I like to call is backing up at deploy. What do I mean by this? So by backing up at deploy, I mean just basically right before deployment time, you take your system down, you back up your database, you run your deployment, and then you bring your system back up. This can be very good. What are some of the advantages? It can guarantee you that you are 100% back to the previous good state because you took the system down, you backed it up, you have that working, hopefully backup. Technically speaking, this could be the safest way you can do it. So what are the disadvantages of this? There's definitely some disadvantages to this. One of the biggest ones I can think of is every application that's depending on the database becomes 100% down. You no longer, can run your system. You no longer can sell items. You no longer can do anything. And it can be really slow. Have you guys ever tried to back up a terabyte database? It does not exactly happen quickly. But kind of some of the things is who should use this method? There are some good candidates for using this. One of the biggest things is applications, if you can withstand to be down, if it's not a mission critical thing, this can be a really good method for you to do because you're guaranteed to get back to a good state if you need to. If your database backs up in 20 seconds, 30 seconds, by all means, you should be doing this. If you're not, then I don't know what to say. And also, if your application does not share any databases, so if it's just you on the database, and you can, with the other things, withstand being down, and you can, back stuff up quickly, then this could be really great for you to do. So what's another method? And Microsoft people should know about this. I will tell you right now, I am not a DACPAC expert. I just know a little bit about it. So I'm sure there are lots of people at this conference that can tell you a lot more about them than I can. But it is a solution to solve this. You kind of have two separate things. You have a profile and a DACPAC. And the profile kind of is what I call the how do I run the DACPAC. And the DACPAC is what changes did I make. And then it looks to see what's on the database currently and compares and applies those changes. What are some of the advantages to this? First of all, it can create easier rollbacks because you can deploy the previous DACPAC in most situations. So there are always those edge cases, but in most situations you can do this. And deploying the previous DACPAC, I want to, another small plug, but we support this automated rollback. So you could do this fairly easily from within Flow. And it also, people that use Visual Studio, they're kind of used to deploying their code in Visual Studio. So those people might really like this. Developers typically like this. Sometimes DBAs don't like it as much for the kind of outlying reasons, but it can be a really good advantage. What are some of the disadvantages? First of all, one of the biggest ones I've seen is if you have issues in that profile that I talked about, it can cause data loss, which nobody wants data loss. And the other thing is it's a Microsoft-only solution. So if you're not a Microsoft-only shop or if you use another database, then it doesn't work. And it's also relatively new, so if you're on an older version, you may not have advantage of this. Once again, who should use this though? I think for Microsoft-only shops, it can be a good solution, actually. You know, it's something that they can use. And if you're having a version of SQL Server, and anyone who used the SQL Server, I mean, should at least look into this. So I would encourage you guys to look at it. So one other thing I want to mention is there's lots of database deployment tools. I think most of these, if not all of these, are here. So look for these guys. You know, these guys actually help with database deployments. And the cool thing about these guys is we, within Flow, integrate into them directly. So you can use Flow and still use this. So it's not that you're choosing something ahead of your automation. We're just saying there's lots of tools out there that can do database deployments. So now I kind of want to go into a little bit of the strategies that you can use. So there's lots of strategies that no matter which one of those previous methods you choose, your strategy of deployment can really help you not have failures, to kind of recover quickly if you need to. So the first strategy that I kind of have, I'm calling the just do it, deploy everything at once. So let's just go to production, throw it out there and do it. You know, you can run individual tests after your deployment. You know, you can roll back all at once. So what are the advantages of this? I guess there's super fast deployments. On successful, things are already out there, so you know you've deployed, you're out there. But unfortunately, there's a lot of disadvantages. It's very dangerous if you have failures. You could bring down your entire system, and you don't really have a lot of time to test because you're taking your production system and you're testing on prod with this method, which is not something you want to do. So that's why I would say I do not recommend this method. It's just I've seen a lot of people that use it, so I wanted to mention it. So the other one I'm going to call a partial deploy. I think some people would call this a canary. There's lots of different ways you can do this. So basically in here, you have a database cluster and an application cluster. You've got your database nodes and your application nodes within here. And so I'm assuming that you've basically clustered your database. So you've got several database nodes. You've clustered your application, so you have several different nodes feeding your application. So in other words, there's like, 10, 20, 100. I think Yvonne mentioned 6,000 maybe. And then when you go to deployment time, you're going to create a deployment cluster. And then you're going to create a deployment application cluster. So basically, you end up having two new load balancers in place that you've created for this deployment. This may be something you've already had in place. You've always had the two deployed ones. And then what you can do is you can take one of your database nodes and move it down into your deployment cluster. And you can take one of your application nodes, or it could be more than one. You don't have to do just one, and move it into your application cluster. And then you can either point a few of your users or just your testing nodes to this new deployment cluster. So your new deployed database, your new deploy application. Once you've determined that this is successful, mind you, everyone else is still in the upper two ones, so they're still in the database and application cluster. Once you've decided this is successful, then and only then you can take the other nodes and bring them down. So you bring your database and application, and now your deploy clusters become your main clusters. Kind of one of the huge things that's really great about this is it allows you to test on a subset of users. If you want to only have a few users that see it, you can do that. If you want to only, run your testing completely external, but quote unquote test in production, even though you're not really testing in production, but at least you're in the production environment, it lets you do that. And on a failure, the cool part is you didn't bring everyone down. You can simply repoint the node on your VIP, and you're good. And it allows you to kind of give a sneak peek. I know some people like to, if they roll out new features, to kind of give somebody, hey, what's the sneak peek of this new feature? There are some disadvantages, however, to doing this. So some of the disadvantages, first of all, it can be extremely complex to maintain. It's one of those things that it's really hard to maintain this because you're maintaining two load balancers, you're maintaining, two application clusters, you're repointing stuff back and forth, and it requires a lot of infrastructure. You often have to, have application changes to make this work because sometimes your applications don't support going to one or two clusters. It doesn't necessarily work. And it requires, kind of synchronizing your databases. So you have to make sure that when you've moved the database, when you have the database in your new cluster, you're keeping it in sync with the other database because stuff never stops with the database. That, however, can be a really great thing that you can do. But one other method I kind of want to go with is rolling deployment. You'll notice this is extremely similar to the previous one, only for this one, we're only going to have a database and an application cluster. For this, we're going to just deploy to one of the database nodes within the cluster and to one of the application nodes within the cluster. Maybe more than one, it can maybe less than one, it just depends. When you've done this deployment, then you're doing as much testing as you can on these ones before you then go to your database cluster. You've brought those back on, and your application, you've brought those back on. So some things with this that I really want to point out. First of all, another little tiny plug is this is native in our product, so we natively support these rolling deployments. I don't know how other products work or not, but it's one of those huge things, so it's a huge advantage that you don't have to clone your infrastructure. Yes, the other method may be a little bit more secure, but the problem that I've seen in a lot of places is they simply can't handle duplicating all of the infrastructure to have two separate nodes. It also allows you to do testing before rolling out to all machines. So this method can definitely work really well when you're wanting to test stuff. And if you already have a cluster, if you already have one, then there's almost no changes required. And like I said before, it's natively built into Electric Flow. There are some disadvantages to this as well, as with everything. So you'll notice I'm not really necessarily going to be giving you this is how to solve the problem, because there's lots of ways to solve the problem. The disadvantage is that you can have version mismatches. It can cause issues sometimes within the application to do it this way. Also, it requires you to have a clustered environment for your DB and application. But I do have a plugin there. If you're not clustering your DB, please do it. And if you're not clustering your application, do that as well. You should not be dependent upon one node. And it can cause a complex overhead in scripts. So this is something where if you don't have a tool in place like Electric Flow, you can have to do a lot of complex scripts to try to decide which nodes you want to go to in what order. So I've got a couple of takeaways that I want you guys to have with this. So some things I want you to remember a little bit. First of all, like I said, I don't necessarily have all the solutions for you in place, but I want you guys to think about some of the stuff. So first of all, stop treating the database like, I call it the stepchild. Before I'd called it the ugly stepchild, and I had somebody scream at me that I shouldn't. But you should consider your databases from when you first start your deployment stuff. You should build them in. Stop just when you're doing a deployment saying, oh, the database is the last thing that I care about because it's difficult. Another thing is different solutions fit different situations. Sometimes what works for me may or may not work for you. It's highly going to depend on what you're doing. So look at all the methods that you can think of and choose what's best for you. Also, another big thing I want you guys to take away is when you're doing database deployments, don't just think about the deployment, think about the failure too. Think about what are you going to do if it fails. Think about what's going to happen if it fails. Another thing is follow some best practices. You should be always backing up your database. You'd be surprised how many people I don't know, or I know that don't do this. One other thing that I would add into this, test your backups. It's the last thing I've seen so many times. Oh, I backed it up, but I didn't test it. Use cloning and testing your failures. Before, in your lower environments, if you're using a pipeline sort of model, in your lower environments, you should be testing failures in those environments so you catch them before you get into a production environment. And also, version the database metadata along with the processes. So in other words, you should know what you're doing for the database. So finally, I just want to say, I would be happy to talk to anybody and, things that I've done, things that I've had. So, here's my contact information. This will get sent out. So I just wanted to thank you guys. There's still some time for questions now, I believe. So are there any questions? Yeah.
And I don't know which of those products handles it better. When it comes to rollback, that's a very, very tricky thing, right?
Yes.
So if I want to add a column, it's very easy to roll that back. If I delete a column, and I realize that there's an issue, right? If I go,
Yeah.
I can't just roll back something that I deleted.
Okay.
So how do those other products, or how do the products, or how does Electric Cloud, or anything
Okay.
you recommend handle that situation?
Okay, so the question was, rolling back can be really difficult because basically if you add a column, yeah, rolling back's easy. You just remove the column you added. The more difficult part is, what if I delete a column? How do I handle the rollback then? And the question was also, what products are out there that do that? I can't speak to the other products that I mentioned out there. I believe all of them have boosts, so I would encourage you to talk to them. From an Electric Cloud standpoint, I would recommend, if you can, doing the backup at deploy method to do that. If you can't do that, then I would highly recommend getting a product in place that does help you handle that. I know that a few of those standardize in that. And the cool thing about Electric Flow with our product is we can help you with the entire, including the database. Like I said before, you shouldn't treat the database as kind of the last thing you think about, but we can help you include the database as a part of your application deployment. So then you're doing the database deployment at the same time. Did I answer your question a little bit? Or?
Kind of, because I think a corollary of that is that if you do the backup, right?
Yes.
And let's say you roll back, you may lose data
Yeah.
that you should have in the meantime. So let's say
you have to synchronize those two things in place.
an hour worth of data.
Yeah.
So how can you do that in a way that you don't lose that data?
Do you have time to talk after this? Because that's more. So the question is, how do you help synchronize so you don't lose the data? Sure, you can do a backup, but if you've had more data added, how do you not lose that data? I would love to answer this. It says I have 3 minutes left on here, and that would take me way longer. But I would love to talk to you about that, though. There's lots of things I can do. Are there any other questions? Oh. With schemaless databases, there are a few different caveats within them. So basically, it's actually almost in a way easier with the schemaless databases because you're no longer so naive about all of this stuff, but they have their own issues just in kind of, at least I've seen a little bit of issues kind of at running them at scale, but. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, guys.